Again, ironically, I got a letter from Unison this week talking about next year's wage claim, making the point that in the first 2 years of the coalition government, with local authorities imposing a freeze, the first one of which is a hangover from a Labour decision when Labour were running the government nationally, the second one is a direct decision the Tories made when they got in 2010, that according to Heather Wakefield from Unison, the average council worker has already lost 13% in purchasing power because of inflation going up and wages not keeping up with the prices going up. This document on Tuesday talked about another year of a wage freeze. We now know it's going to be 3 years of a freeze, and at the end of that, 2 years when wages will go up by 1%. I reckon that by the end of this Parliament, there'll be something like a 20% cut in the living standards of council workers. The biggest cut of any group of workers for 80 or 90 years. Now it may be if you're a boss of Centrica, of British Gas, on about 900 grand wage and another 900 grand at a bonus, and out of your 900 grand, if they say you've got to take a 20% cut, you could just about survive on £700,000 a year. But if your wage is such that you're away from not meeting the mortgage or the rent, or the bills, or the kids' school, a 20% cut means you drown. It means you don't have an excess that you can fall back on, but you drown. And that's why bodies like the Citizens Advice and other similar charities in the city are seeing a rise in people, not just people who are being made unemployed, but people who are in work who can't make ends meet because of wage freezes while inflation is going through the roof. Now, we've had reports in the last few weeks that in Coventry and Warwickshire, there's 35,000 children living in families officially under the poverty line. We know there's 24,000 people on the housing waiting list now in Coventry. And in addition to all those, for what it actually saves, it's just a bloody insult, and an insult to injury, the council decided to raise £400,000 by increasing or introducing charges, including, for example, the 13,000 disabled people entitled to a blue badge in the city are now going to pay £10 to that badge. And I say, for the amount of money it raises, given the hundreds of millions of pound budget of the city council, it's just frankly an insult that at a time when bankers and utility bosses are getting bonuses in millions, we turn around to people who've perhaps lost limbs or can't walk very far and say we want you to make an extra little bit of a sacrifice so we can pay off the gambling debts of the bankers who got us into this mess in the first place. So that was Labour's budget. In a sense, I apologise, I can't give you more detail. I've brought a couple of spare copies if you want to go through it. You can read through it, you will not find much more detail than I've given. That appears, as I say, after the election and as the year goes on. So the Tories, they objected to it. They moved an amendment. They agreed with the £17 million and they agreed with 89% of Labour's suggested way of cutting that 17, but they wanted to change 11% of the cuts, 1.9 million, that's 17 million, they wanted to cut in a different way. Again, from an electoral point of view, they talked about protecting the children's centres for the next 12 months, a small amount of money for residents' parking schemes, a pay award for those earning under 21,000 for the City Council, which incidentally, I don't know what the figures locally, but nationally, it's attracting over 2/3, 68 or 69% of all council workers earn less than £21,000 a year. By and large, council workforce is not a highly paid until you get to the assistant director and director level, of course, when it exceeds £100,000 and the chief executive gets £215,000 a year. And ironically, it was only me and Rob at the time who voted against that package when Stella Manzi left and Martin Reeves took over. The main parties were in favour of the chief executive being paid that amount. To pay for those changes, the Tories talked about cutting the union's ability to represent their members by not allowing so many union negotiators on a local scale. I declare an interest, as most people know, my partner Jane does that for the NUT. I just wonder, by the way, how much councils actually think they would save if they did get rid of some of the union officials. I reckon the union local officials save time and money with their negotiation and sorting problems within the local authority. And the one time when they were taken out of the equation, when the Tories imposed a single status deal on the workforce, we've spent, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of pounds now on lawyers' fees, because these things are sorted out in the courts, rather than being sorted out between union negotiators and human resources managers in the council itself. So the point to be made, though, is that the Tories agreed with Labour that 17 million was to be cut. They just had a 10% difference in how exactly the detail of that would be cut itself. Now, the worst aspect of the budget, to my mind, is that the way in which it was announced, and you have to go on the website if you don't believe me, but at the end of the opening speech, where the Labour Deputy Leader announced £17 million worth of cuts, 400 to 500 job losses, rises in charges, etc., etc., he was applauded by all the Labour councillors present for a considerable amount of time, as if he'd been announcing a budget of expansion, of additional spending, of good news for Coventry. Instead of that, he was announcing cuts and job losses, and almost unbelievably, he was applauded by all the Labour councillors. What the budget contributes towards is the overlapping agenda between Labour and the Tories, that there is no alternative. The old phrase that Maggie Thatcher used to use 20-odd years ago, Tina, there is no alternative. We have to make these cuts to pay back the money that's been borrowed in order to sort out the gambling debts of the bankers. There's nothing even of Labour 20 or 30 years ago, which I was a member in the 1970s and the 1980s, at least had the aspiration of wanting to change the world. Now Labour is limited by its ambition of wanting to manage the decline of Coventry rather than anybody else managing that decline. Not an ounce of resistance was put forward. Now, there clearly are ways in which things can be challenged. In the short term, they could be carry out certain of the cuts. They've got £48 million in reserves, about 12 million of which is actually schools money held by the council, but 11.5 million of that reserves is there to pay for the costs of dismissing people over the next couple of years. They could use, just think that even if they didn't agree with our or my proposal of refusing to carry out the whole of the 17 million cuts package and temporarily plugging the gap by using the reserves, even if you just set up one or two of the cuts, let's say the short start nurseries in the children's centres are going to go down to a part-time basis instead of the full-time care that is in many of the centres happening at the moment. What you have by Labour carrying out those cuts is parents, rightly, blaming Labour locally and blaming the Tories in London. If Labour seriously wanted to rebuild any reputation amongst local people, they could take that money out of the reserves on condition they could say to the parents and the communities affected, we will jointly campaign, council, community, parents, those that rely on the service, we will jointly campaign for the next 12 months to force the government in London to fully fund this local service. Are you with us on that campaign? That's a simple thing the council could do, and they could do it quite the same in other areas where the cuts are proposed. In the case of leisure services, which we can talk about as the meeting goes on, or in housing, or in other forms of service delivery. They could pull people onto their side, but they're not even prepared to make that.